I was watching TV in the family room while sitting in my green armchair, and the news was playing low, because that was the only way I could stand it, and evenings were the only time I ever felt even a small amount of peace in that house, and my body felt worn down from the day, but my mind felt calm in a quiet, careful way that I had learned to appreciate. I held my coffee with both hands and leaned back a little, letting my shoulders drop, because I had learned over the years that moments like this never stayed long, and when they came I needed to sit still and accept them instead of waiting for the next problem. House felt unusually quiet, and I remember thinking that all I wanted was a few minutes without noise or tension or anyone needing something from me, and I breathed slowly while looking at the screen, letting my thoughts wander, because for once nothing felt urgent. That calm ended the moment I heard heavy footsteps coming from the hallway, and I did not turn my head because I already knew who walked like that, and my chest tightened before I even saw him, because my body recognized the sound before my mind did. My son-in-law, Derek, walked into the room with the same hard confidence he always carried, and he moved like the house belonged to him instead of me. And he did not greet me or slow his pace as he crossed the room like I was not even there. He stopped directly in front of the television, blocking my view, and I stayed seated hoping he would move away on his own, because I did not have the energy for another argument. And I told myself that staying quiet might keep things from getting worse instead. He reached out and switched the TV off, and the sound vanished so suddenly that the room felt hollow and the silence pressed in around me in a way that made my stomach tighten. Derek looked down at me and said, "Go to your room, old woman," and his voice was flat and cold, like he was stating a rule instead of speaking to a person. And then he said the living room was his now, and those words did not rush past me but stayed heavy in the air. I slowly lifted my head and looked at his face, searching for even a trace of shame or hesitation, but I saw none, and what I saw instead was certainty. Like this was normal to him, and like he believed he had every right to say those things. I turned my head toward the kitchen, because part of me still hoped my daughter would speak. And Lena was standing there holding shopping bags with both hands, and her shoulders looked tired and low, and her eyes were fixed on the floor, like she was trying not to see what was happening. She did not look at me, and she did not say a single word, and she did not remind him that I was her mother, or that this was my house, and that silence from her settled deeper in my chest than anything Derek had said. I waited longer than I should have, because I believed that maybe if I gave the moment enough time, something would change, and maybe she would speak up. But nothing happened, and the quiet stayed where it was. That silence hurt more than the insult, because I expected cruelty from Derek, but I never expected my daughter to disappear right in front of me when I needed her most. And that realization landed slowly and painfully. In that moment, something inside me became very clear, and it was not anger or tears or fear, but a calm understanding that something important had reached its end, and that I could not keep pretending things would improve. I placed my hands on the arms of the chair and stood up, slowly feeling my knees complain as I rose, and Derek stepped aside, just enough to drop onto my couch like nothing had happened, and he opened a soda and put his feet up as if the space already belonged to him. He did not look at me as I walked past him, and that told me more than words ever could. I moved down the hallway without rushing, because I no longer felt the need to hurry or explain myself to anyone. Each step felt steady, even though my heart felt heavy. And when I reached my bedroom, I closed the door behind me, not to hide, but because I needed a quiet place to think clearly for the first time in a long while. I walked to my dresser and opened the bottom drawer where I kept a leather folder I had owned for many years, and it felt stiff and familiar in my hands, and inside were papers that held more truth than anything spoken in that house. I pulled out the deed and saw my name printed clearly, and seeing it grounded me in a way I had not felt in a long time, because it reminded me of every payment, every sacrifice, and every quiet choice I had made without asking anyone for permission. I walked over to the mirror and looked at myself and saw grey hair glasses hanging on a chain and a face shaped by years of work and patience. And I saw a woman many people mistook for weak simply because she did not raise her voice. I knew they were wrong, and I placed the folder back in the drawer and picked up my keys and stood there for a moment feeling something shift inside me, knowing that this night was not just another bad moment. Something had already begun to change. I stood there in my bedroom holding my keys and listening to the sounds of the house outside. My door and everything felt distant, like I was already somewhere else. And for the first time in a long while, I did not feel rushed or pushed or afraid. The room was small, but it was mine, and the air felt different in there, quieter and steadier. And I took a slow breath and let it out while reminding myself that I was safe in that moment, and that no one could take that away from me. Sat down on the edge of my bed and rested my hands in my lap, and I could feel them shaking just a little. Not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had been held in for so long. And I let myself sit with that feeling instead of pushing it away. My eyes moved around the room and landed on the familiar things: the old lamp by the bed, the worn chair near the window, the small photos on the dresser. And each item carried a memory of years that had passed quietly without complaint. I thought about how long I had lived in that house, and how many changes I had seen, and how often I had chosen peace over argument and patience over pride, because I believed that was what love required, even when it cost me more than. I wanted to admit. I reached for the leather folder again, and opened it slowly as if I was afraid the truth inside might disappear if I moved too fast, and the papers rested neatly inside, just as they always had, waiting without judgment or emotion. I held the deed in my hands and read my name again and again, and each time it felt stronger and clearer, and it reminded me that this house was not given to me by anyone, and it was not something I owed to anyone. I remembered the long days I worked and the nights I stayed awake worrying about bills and repairs and responsibilities, and how I never asked for thanks because I believed doing the right thing was enough. I thought about the day I signed those papers and how proud I felt standing there alone, knowing I had built something solid with my own effort, and that pride returned quietly now, like an old friend who had been waiting patiently for years. I had allowed others to treat that house like it was theirs, and I told myself it was easier that way and kinder and less stressful. But sitting there, I finally understood that kindness should never require silence. In the face of disrespect, I closed the folder and placed it carefully back in the drawer. And as I did, I felt something settle inside me, not anger and not sadness, but resolve, calm, steady resolve that did not need to shout or prove itself. I stood up and walked to the window and looked outside at the street and the trees and the familiar view I had seen for so many years, and it looked the same as always, but I knew I was not the same person who had looked out that window before. I rested my hand on the glass and thought about my daughter, and the way she stood there in the kitchen silent and tired, and I felt a deep ache in my chest, not just for what had happened, but for everything that had led to that moment. I wondered when she had stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as something to step around. And I knew that question would stay with me for a long time. But even with that pain, I did not feel weak, and I did not feel broken, and that surprised me because I had spent so long believing that standing up for myself would feel loud and messy. Instead, it felt quiet and clear, like a line drawn inside me that could not be crossed again. I moved back toward the bed and sat down once more, and for a moment I simply listened to my own breathing and let it guide me forward, one slow breath at a time. I knew I could not stay in that room forever, and I knew I could not walk back into the living room pretending nothing had happened. And that understanding felt final. My hands stopped shaking, and I noticed that change with a small sense of calm, and I realized that this was the first time in a long while that my body and my mind were finally agreeing with each other. Whatever happened next would not be easy, and it would not be painless, but it would be honest, and that mattered more to me than comfort ever had. Stood up again and straightened my shoulders and looked around the room one last time, before reaching for my purse and slipping my keys inside. I did not know exactly what I would do next, but I knew I would not stay silent anymore, and that knowledge felt like a quiet strength rising inside me. Opened the bedroom door slowly and stepped into the hallway ready to face whatever came next, knowing that something important had already shifted, and there was no going back to the way things had been. I stepped into the hallway, and the house felt different, like it no longer held me the same way, and each sound seemed farther away, as if I was already letting go. I could hear Derek in the living room moving around, and I could hear the faint noise of the soda can and the television coming back on, and none of it pulled at me the way it used to. I walked down the hallway at a steady pace, and my feet felt firm on the floor, and I noticed how calm my body felt, even though my heart was still heavy. As I passed the kitchen, I saw my daughter again, standing in the same spot, and she still did not look at me, and I waited just a moment, not because I expected anything, but because part of me needed to be sure. She said nothing, she did nothing, and in that silence I accepted what was in front of me, walked past her, and continued toward the front door, and with every step I felt lighter, like something invisible was slipping off my shoulders. When I reached the door, I placed my hand on the handle and paused, and I looked around the house, slowly taking in the walls, the floors, the corners I had cleaned and cared for over the years. I remembered holidays, quiet mornings, long evenings, and all the work that had gone into keeping that place together, even when no one noticed. There was no anger in me at that moment, only clarity. I opened the door, and the air outside felt cool against my face, and it woke me up in a way I had not felt in a long time. I stepped outside and closed the door gently behind me, and I stood there for a second, listening to the sounds of the street and feeling the space around me. Then I reached into my purse and took out my keys, and I locked the door from the outside. And when I heard the lock click, something inside me settled. That sound felt final. I walked down the steps and onto the sidewalk, and the sky above looked wide and open, and I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I did not rush. I did not look back. I walked a short distance and raised my hand when I saw a cab coming, and it pulled over and stopped in front of me. Opened the door and got in and told the driver downtown, and my voice sounded steady when I said it as the car pulled away. I watched the house fade from view, and I noticed that my hands were resting quietly in my lap, and they were not shaking. The streets passed by slowly, and the lights began to glow as evening settled in, and I felt like I was watching a life I had already lived drift away. I thought about how many times I had stayed silent to keep peace, and how often that silence had cost me more than speaking ever would have. I realized that leaving that house was not running away, and it was not giving up, and it was not weakness. It was a choice. Cab moved through the city, and I watched people on the sidewalks and cars at the lights, and everything felt strangely calm, like the world was continuing without needing anything from me. Reached into my purse and took out my phone, and I scrolled slowly until I found a name I had not called in years. Andrew Sterling. He had helped me once before, when I needed clear answers and honest advice, and I trusted him because he never talked down to me or rushed me. Held the phone in my hand for a moment and looked out the window, and I thought about how long I had waited to make a call like this. Then I pressed the button and listened as it rang. When he answered and said my name, I felt a small sense of relief, and I told him I needed help, and I told him I needed to talk. He said he would meet me, and his voice was calm and certain, and that steadiness reached me through the phone. I ended the call and leaned back in the seat, and for the first time that night, I felt awake and present instead of worn down. Cab continued forward, and the city lights moved past the window, and I understood that something important had already begun, and there was no turning back. Whatever came next would come on my terms, top of form. The cab slowed as we reached downtown, and the buildings around us stood taller and closer together, and the lights reflected off the windows like quiet reminders that life kept moving whether I was ready or naughty. Paid the driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk, and the night air felt cooler here and steadier. And I stood still for a moment, letting my feet settle on the ground. I looked around and chose a small cafe that stayed open late. And I walked inside and found a seat near the window, where I could see the street but still feel a little hidden. The place was calm and mostly empty, and the low sound of dishes and soft voices made it easier to think. I ordered tea and wrapped my hands around the warm cup when it arrived, and the heat traveled into my fingers and helped steady. May sat there and waited, and during that time memories began to surface, not all at once, but slowly, one after another, like they had been waiting for quiet. I thought about the early years when I first bought the house, and how proud I felt standing in those empty rooms, knowing they were mine and knowing I had done it on my own. I remembered painting the walls, fixing small things, saving every extra dollar, and telling myself that security mattered more than comfort. I remembered my daughter as a little girl running through the hallway, laughing and calling my name, and how I promised myself I would always give her a safe place. I wondered when that promise had shifted into something else, and how slowly it must have happened for me not to notice until now. The door opened and closed a few times, and then I saw Andrew walk in, and he spotted me quickly and came over with a calm smile that made me feel a little less alone. He sat across from me and asked if I was all right, and I told him I was shaken but clear, and that felt like the truth. He listened without interrupting as I told him what had happened, and I spoke slowly and carefully, and for once I did not soften the details or protect anyone from the truth. I told him about Derek and the way he spoke to me, and about my daughter standing silent, and about the feeling that something had finally broken. Andrew nodded and let me finish, and when I was done, he said one simple thing that stayed with me: "Do not have to accept this." Those words settled into me quietly, and I realized how long it had been since anyone said something so clear to me. He reminded me that the house was legally mine, and that no one had the right to tell me where I could sit or when I had to leave. He spoke in a steady way, without anger and without drama, and that steadiness made everything feel more real. Asked him what my options were, and he laid them out plainly and said I could take my time and choose what felt right for me. Did not rush me, and he did not pressure me, and for the first time that night I felt like I was being treated with respect. As he talked, I felt my shoulders relax and my breathing slow, and I noticed that I was sitting straighter than before. I thanked him and told him I would think about everything, and he said he would be there when I was ready. After he left, I stayed in the cafe a little longer and watched the street again, and the world outside no longer felt heavy or threatening. I felt tired, but it was a clean kind of tired, like the kind that comes after making a hard choice. I finished my tea and stood up and stepped back outside, and the city lights looked softer now, and I realized that I was not afraid of going forward. I did not know exactly what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure: I was done shrinking myself to keep others comfortable, and that decision felt like the beginning of something solid and true. Bottom of form, I did not go back to the house that night, and instead I stayed at a small hotel nearby, and the room was simple but quiet, and that was enough for me. Slept lightly and woke up early, and for the first time in a long while, I did not wake up with a knot in my chest. Morning light came through the curtains, and I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the quiet, and I realized that I felt clear instead of confused. I made coffee in the small machine by the window, and stood there holding the warm cup and thinking about everything Andrew had said the night before. He had not filled my head with fear or threats, and he had not told me what I should do, and that mattered to me more than I expected. He had simply reminded me of the truth, and the truth felt steady. After breakfast, I called him again and told him I was ready to take the next step, and he said we would move slowly and carefully, and that there was no rush. Later that day, I met him at his office and the building was quiet and clean, and the chairs in the waiting area were firm and uncomfortable. But I sat tall anyway. When we went into his office, he laid out the paperwork and explained each part in simple language, and he made sure I understood everything before moving on. There were forms to review and letters to prepare and steps to take, and none of it felt overwhelming because I was no longer trying to protect people who had not protected me. Signed my name where it belonged, and each time the pen touched the paper I felt a little stronger. Andrew told me that the first thing would be to establish clear boundaries and clear ownership, and that everything else would follow from there. He said I had the right to live in my own home without fear or insult, and hearing that spoken out loud felt like permission I should never have needed. As I left his office that afternoon, I felt tired but steady, and I walked slower than usual, letting myself feel the ground under my feet. I spent the rest of the day running small errands and taking my time and noticing things I had ignored for years. I bought myself a proper meal and sat alone and ate slowly, without rushing or worrying about anyone else. That evening my phone buzzed and I saw my daughter's name on the screen, and for a moment I just looked at it. Did not feel anger, and I did not feel panic. And that surprised me. Answered calmly, and she asked where I was, and her voice sounded unsure and careful. I told her I was safe, and that I needed space, and that was all. She started to say something else, but stopped, and the silence returned. And this time it did not crush me. Ended the call gently and placed the phone down, and I knew that things were already shifting, even if no one else understood it yet. Later that night, Andrew sent a message letting me know the first notices would go out in the morning, and that everything was moving forward. I read the message twice and then set the phone aside and looked out the window. I felt a mix of sadness and relief, and neither one overwhelmed me. Thought about the woman I had been for so many years, always adjusting, always giving, always hoping things would improve on their own. And I realized that hoping without action had kept me stuck. That night, as I lay down to sleep, I felt a quiet sense of control return to me. Not loud, not proud, just firm. I did not know how Derek would react or what my daughter would say when the truth settled in, but I knew one thing clearly. Balance had shifted, and for the first time in a very long time I was no longer standing on the weaker side. The next morning I woke up before my alarm, and for a moment I forgot where I was. And then I remembered, and instead of fear I felt calm. I got dressed slowly and looked at myself in the mirror, and I noticed how steady my eyes looked, and that steadiness stayed with me as I stepped outside later. That day Andrew called and told me the notices had been delivered, and his voice was even and professional, and he said everything had gone exactly as planned. I thanked him, and after the call ended I sat quietly and waited, because I knew the reaction would come sooner or later. It did not take long. My phone rang, and when I saw my daughter's name again I answered, and this time her voice sounded tight and rushed. She asked what was going on and why papers had arrived at the house, and I told her calmly that I had spoken with a lawyer and that I was setting clear boundaries. She grew quiet, and then she said Derek was angry and confused, and that he did not understand why I was doing this. I listened without interrupting, and when she finished, I told her that I was doing it because I deserved respect, and because the house was legally mine. There was a pause, and then she said Derek felt betrayed, and that word hung between. You see, told her betrayal was telling someone to leave their own living room and expecting silence in return. She did not answer right away, and when she did her voice was softer and uncertain. She said she never thought things had gone that far. I told her that was part of the problem. We ended the call quietly, and I placed the phone down and felt the weight of it settle. But it did not crush me. That afternoon Andrew called again and said Derek had contacted his office, and that his tone had been demanding and dismissive. Andrew said he had made it clear that the law was not on Derek's side, and that any further communication should go through him. Hearing That felt strange and relieving at the same time. For years I had handled everything on my own, and now someone else was holding the line for me. As the day passed, messages came in from family members who had heard bits and pieces, and some were confused, and some were supportive, and I read them slowly without responding right away. I realized that I did not owe anyone immediate answers. That evening I took a walk, and the air felt light, and the world felt wide, and I noticed how my shoulders no longer felt pulled up around my ears. I thought about how fear had shaped my choices for so long, and how quietly it had crept in without me noticing. Standing there, I understood that courage did not arrive loudly, arrived quietly when I finally stopped arguing with myself. When I returned to my room, my phone buzzed one last time, and it was a message from my daughter saying she needed time. I read it once and set the phone aside, and I knew that time was exactly what I was finally allowing myself. Whatever came next would come slowly and clearly, and this time I would not step back to make it easier for anyone else here. Few days passed, and the noise around everything began to settle, and in that quiet space I noticed how different my days felt without constant tension hanging over me. Woke each morning without dread, and that alone told me how heavy things had been. Before, Andrew kept me updated and told me that Derek was pushing back harder now and claiming confusion and unfair treatment, and listening to that no longer made my stomach tighten. It felt distant, like someone else's problem. My daughter called again, and this time her voice sounded tired instead of sharp, and she asked if we could meet and talk. I agreed, and we chose a small park halfway between where I was staying and the house. And when I arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench. She looked smaller than I remembered, and older too, and that hurt more than I expected. We sat in silence at first, and the air between us felt careful. She finally spoke and said she never thought things would reach this point, and that she felt stuck between her husband and her mother. I listened and did not interrupt, and when she finished, I told her that I have felt stuck for years. Toei told her how it felt to be spoken to like I did not matter, and how painful it was to see her stay quiet when I needed her voice. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry, and she said she was afraid of conflict and afraid of losing her marriage. I told her I understood fear, but that fear did not excuse silence when someone was being hurt. We sat with that truth for a long moment, and I could see it landing slowly. She asked why I did not say anything sooner, and I told her I had been hoping love would be enough. I told her love without respect slowly wears a person down. She nodded and looked away, and I knew she was seeing things differently now, even if she was not ready to say it. When we stood to leave, she reached out and hugged me, and it felt hesitant but real, and I held her without pulling away. As we parted, I knew our relationship had changed, and I did not know yet what it would become, but I knew it could no longer stay the same. That evening, Andrew called again and said Derek had agreed to meet and talk under legal guidance, and that the tone had shifted. He said control often turns to panic when it meets limits. I smiled at that because it felt true. I spent the rest of the night reflecting on how strength had entered my life quietly, and without permission. I had not planned to confront anyone or change anything. I had simply stopped accepting what hurt me, and in doing that, I had changed everything. Path ahead was still uncertain, but it was mine, and for the first time that felt like enough. The meeting was set for later that week, and knowing it was coming did not fill me with fear the way it once would have, and instead, I felt prepared in a quiet, steady way. I spent the days before it keeping my routine simple and calm, and I noticed how much lighter my body felt. When I was no longer bracing for the next insult, Andrew called to explain how the meeting would go. And he spoke clearly and slowly, and reminded me that I did not need to argue or convince anyone of anything. He said the truth was already written down, and that was enough. On the day of the meeting, I dressed plainly and comfortably, and looked at myself in the mirror, and saw someone who no longer needed to prove her worth. When I arrived at the office, Derek was already there sitting stiffly, with his arms crossed, and he did not look at me at first. My daughter sat beside him, and she looked nervous and tired, and I felt a quiet sadness, but I did not let it pull me back. We all took our seats, and Andrew began by stating the facts in a calm, professional voice, and as he spoke I watched Derek's posture soften little by little. When it was my turn to speak, I did not raise my voice, and I did not accuse, and I simply said that I expected respect and peace in my own home. I said that I would no longer accept being spoken to with cruelty or being pushed aside, and that I was setting clear boundaries. Derek tried to interrupt, and Andrew stopped him gently and reminded him that this was not a debate. For the first time, Derek looked uncertain, and that uncertainty told me more than anger ever could. My daughter me then, and her eyes held something new, not anger, not fear, but recognition. Andrew explained the next steps and the expectations and made it clear that any violation would have consequences. When the meeting ended, Derek stood up without speaking and left the room quickly. My daughter stayed behind, and she looked at me and said she was sorry, and I believed her even if I knew trust would take time. We hugged briefly, and there was space in it, not the heavy kind, but the honest kind. As I walked out of the building, I felt a sense of closure settle in slowly. Nothing had exploded, nothing had been dramatic, and yet everything had changed. I realized that power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply stands still and refuses to move. That night, as I lay down to rest, I felt calm in a way I had not felt in years. Storm had passed, and what remained was quiet strength. The days after the meeting felt slower and quieter, and I welcomed that pace because it gave me time to notice how much had changed inside me. Returned to the house during the day while Derek was at work and my daughter was out, and walking through the rooms felt strange and familiar at the same time. Nothing looked different, but everything felt different. I opened windows and let fresh air move through the house, and I noticed how still it felt, without tension filling every corner. I sat in the family room again and looked at the green armchair, and for a moment I simply stood there, remembering how small I had felt sitting in it that night. Then I sat down, and I did not feel small. I took my time cleaning and sorting and moving things the way I wanted them, and there was no rush and no fear of being watched. My daughter came home later, and we spoke quietly and carefully, and there were no raised voices and no blame. She told me she was thinking about her own choices and that she needed time to decide what kind of life she wanted. I told her I supported her, but that I would no longer disappear to make things easier. She nodded, and I could see she understood, even if it scared her. That night I slept in my own bed, and the house felt calm in a way it never had before. In the morning, I made breakfast and ate slowly, and looked out the window and felt grounded. Messages came in from family and friends, and some were awkward, and some were kind, and I answered only when I felt ready. I was no longer trying to manage everyone's feelings. I spent the afternoon organizing old boxes and found photos, letters, and small memories, and I let myself smile and feel sad and remember. Without judgment, I realized how much of my life I had lived quietly, and how much strength that quiet had actually taken in. The evening I walked through the neighborhood, and neighbors waved and smiled, and nothing felt broken or ruined. The world had not ended. Because I spoke up, it had opened. As I returned home, I felt something settle inside me that felt like peace, not the fragile kind that depends on silence, but the strong kind that comes from knowing where you stand. And I knew that whatever happened next, I would meet it without shrinking away. Time continued to move forward in a quiet, steady way, and nothing dramatic followed the changes that had already happened. And that surprised me. More than anything, life did not fall apart, and it did not suddenly become perfect either. And instead it settled into something honest and manageable. My daughter made her own decisions slowly and carefully, and there were days when she seemed strong and days when she seemed unsure, and I let her have that space. I no longer tried to guide every step or fix every feeling, and that was new for both of us. Derek moved out not long after, and the house felt lighter in a way I cannot fully explain, and it was not joy, and it was not relief alone. It was peace, not the kind that comes from silence or avoidance, but the kind that comes from truth being spoken and respected. I rearranged the family room and placed the green armchair by the window where the light came in during the afternoon, and when I sat there, I felt present instead of guarded. Sometimes I watched the news, and sometimes I turned the television off and listened to the quiet, and both felt like choices instead of compromises. Andrew checked in from time to time, and his role slowly became smaller, and that felt right. Because the work had been done, I handled my days on my own terms now, and I trusted myself in a way I had forgotten was possible. There were moments of sadness, especially when I thought about the years I spent shrinking myself to keep peace, and I allowed those thoughts to come and go without fighting them. I did not blame myself anymore. I understood that I had done the best I could with what I knew at the time. Neighbors stopped by, and conversations felt easier, and laughter returned in small, gentle ways, and I noticed how much lighter my voice sounded when I spoke. One afternoon, my daughter sat with me at the kitchen table, and we drank tea and talked about ordinary things, and there was comfort in that normal moment. She looked at me and said she was proud of me, and I believed her, and that mattered. As the weeks passed, I settled into routines that felt like mine again, and I slept better and breathed easier and trusted the quiet instead of fearing it. Learned that strength does not always look loud or forceful, and sometimes it looks like standing still and refusing to accept less than respect. Looking back, I know that night in the living room changed everything, and not because of the insult or the silence, but because I finally listened to myself. I stopped waiting for permission. I stopped hoping someone else would fix what hurt me. Chose myself, and that choice carried me forward into a life that feels calm and steady and real now. When I sit in my green armchair in the evening, and the house is quiet, I feel something I once thought was gone forever. I feel at home, and that is enough. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend.